everybody. Thanks for joining this episode of High Trust Secrets. I'm here with Donna Dodson, Jeff McHugh, and Stephen Dufour, kind of the core group, the core four, if you will, and just taking on any questions that people have or any comments they have about high trust, the compliance journey, compliance in general, governance, risk, and compliance, really. And we're here to help. So, anybody have any questions that have come up over the week? Nothing. Well, I had something that came across through ISACA, which is the auditing organization, and they are starting to jump on the AI bandwagon. It's funny, I was at a conference a couple weeks ago and talking to a friend of mine who a lot of times presents at these conferences, and I asked him, I said, "Hey, you're doing a breakout session?" He's like, "No." He goes, "I forgot to put AI in my synopsis, so nobody picked me." Because it seemed like everything was, all about AI. But ISACA has started some AI certifications from an audit perspective, which I thought were pretty interesting. So I still got more to take a look at here, but definitely wanted to, let's see, I can share my screen. Yeah, that big green button that says share. Um, so
What are the basic courses, Susan? I'm curious.
hang on. So for ISACA,
Yeah, the
Mhm.
AI.
They've got two of them. So this is the one that came to me. And it's basically, hey, your CISM, which is, Information Security Manager. So this would be, AI security management would be another potential certification to do. So ISACA Advanced in AI Security Management. They're saying it's the first and only AI-centric security managed certification.
I wonder if that's yeah, it says AI governance and program management. So like the managing of the technical aspect versus the managing of the administrative aspect, right? Here's all the documentation versus, the
Exactly. So yeah.
TLS or
So
something
making
like
sure
that.
you have that plus, doing an AI risk assessment, your vendor supply chain, considerations of that, as well as it talks about technologies. So this one looks, because there, like I said, there are two of them that they're talking about, but I was definitely going to do some more research on this and kind of see, I haven't seen, obviously it's brand new, so I haven't seen any, job descriptions or people clamoring for this, but I did think it's probably a pretty at least a good start or a good attempt at starting for this. There's also under credentialing advanced in AI
And do they
audit.
cover high trust?
No, ISACA is vendor or framework agnostic. So they're just looking at like this is basically like um, the audit certificate that you get. It's agnostic of any particular, it's not
Right.
ISC squared or anything like that, where it's looking for specific.
So I was looking for a course that is the opposite of
Right,
framework agnostic. I'm looking for a course that is framework comprehensive,
right.
that has kind of all the major frameworks, high trust, SOC 2, ISO 27001, throw NIST in there, happy to look at the PCI or anything else that's kind of remotely relevant.
Hmm.
Um, I would really love a course that's got all of them in there and talks about the differences between them and why one might be an advantage over another. And I've been looking, as every chance I get, I take a peek to see what I can find. Does anybody have one or know of one or know somebody putting one together?
I haven't seen any. Like I said, this one is kind of the way like they have ISACA has their certified information systems auditor. This one
Mhm.
seems to be that counterpart in an AI perspective. And then they've got the CISM, so that's CISA, then they've got CISM, and then this one seems to be that counterpart, a CISM to, managing AI infrastructures in a secure manner. So,
I
All
but
I
right.
again,
know
yeah,
there
Yeah,
I
ISACA's
I
know
guess
always been
from my
agnostic.
perspective, I'm looking for something that's not the techie controls. I'm looking for something that is more strategic leadership. I'm in a role where I need to decide for my organization. I'm not going to be implementing the controls. Maybe I have, maybe I never have, But from a business perspective, why would I choose one framework over another instead of just throwing a dart and hoping I get the right
Right.
one? Why would I choose one? Because it also then leaves, the person who's got that information better able to guide and inform leadership, other key stakeholders about why it's helpful and there's a good reason to go down this path as opposed to another path.
Right.
Yeah, I think your best bet is to find individual providers of that
Yeah.
particular training. So, I think I mentioned whenever we talked a couple weeks ago,
Mhm.
IAPP has very general AI risk training. I
Yeah.
believe it's called the AIGP, AI Governance Professional Training. I
Okay.
never took the
Yeah.
certification because like I don't do
Right.
certifications. But the training was really,
I
really
don't
good.
blame you.
There's too many certifications out there, and I never get
Well, and
calls
there's
back.
too many organizations who don't practice what they preach, which is why I don't have a
Correct.
PMP,
There you
because
go.
I worked with PMI enough to know that they don't actually use their own project management inside for their own projects. And I was like, no, on basic principle, I'm not going to get the certification.
Right.
So,
And another provider is Walter Haydock from StackAware. He has an email only course that goes through ISO 42001 and its various
okay,
controls and implementations and risk.
okay.
Those are the two really good ones. There's another course. I can send you after the meeting. I can
Yeah.
send you a link to it where it is a free. This is AI risk training. Um, they just offer. I want to say it might be like Prompt Armor or something like that. I'll look it up and send it to
Okay.
you, but it's free as well. It's a really good
Yeah,
AI
that
training.
sounds great. That
Cool.
sounds great because it's even like the kind of different government frameworks and that sort of thing. People say it's DoD or are we using that acronym anymore? DOW, um,
Yeah.
and looking at like that, but the government frameworks miss out on a lot because they don't have the same level of third party security assessment and requirements because they don't allow you to
Right.
go to a third party in a lot of
Yeah. There's
cases.
no cloud hosted environment.
You know,
No
you
public
can't
cloud.
just farm it out.
Right.
You're hired to do it. You have to do it.
Right. The only one I was thinking of was the GIAC. And again, I haven't explored it enough to see if they would
Mhm.
have it to look at all the different frameworks and see, is there
Mm.
anybody that's looking at a comprehensive of the most common security frameworks and saying, hey,
Yeah.
does somebody understand when to apply what?
Yeah.
So this would be the only one that I could see that could potentially have that. But again, I'm not familiar enough with GIAC.
Okay.
So we'll do some more research and see if we can figure that out at some point.
Do any of you know anybody from ISACA to come in and talk about their training and certifications for AI? Is
I
that a thing?
don't. I mean, we've got a pretty robust chapter here in Middle Tennessee. I can always see if there's somebody there that would
Yeah.
be willing to do that.
I have a friend who's on the board, but he's new. So you probably want to get the president or somebody like that, right?
Yeah, we could have them on. That would work.
I think that'd be a great topic in the future.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it would be.
then let's not go for my friend. Let's go for someone who's,
Okay.
you know,
Well, use your friend to find out if
yes, yeah.
if
Well,
there's somebody that would
so I
do this.
mean, yeah, okay,
Yeah, that'd definitely work.
yeah.
So that was really the only thing I had that came across this week. I'm still working through a Vanta an organization that's using Vanta in an R2. And we did find that there are some that are the templated, the most common controls, have, okay, here are the documents, here are the policies, the policy addendums, et cetera, that you need to create. But there's some controls that are specific to this organization that are not, I think, broadly held enough that Vanta doesn't have a template for them. So they show up in Vanta because they're, that assessment object is now connected to Vanta, but it basically has, it's almost like a shell of a requirement. So it has the high trust requirement name in it, but there's no supporting evidence already attached. So it's a matter of going through piecemeal and saying, okay, well, 2 years ago when they did this and they used this control, what did we use for evidence? And then making sure that we upload that into Vanta so that they have that. Or if it was part of a policy document and maybe Vanta doesn't have that templated language ready to add into that policy document, that we add it to their policy document, et cetera. So these are controls that they've already implemented because they were they did this. They've done this is like probably their fourth high trust certification, but it's a matter of still there's a manual aspect of this. But I told them, I said, we want everything in your Vanta repository so that
Hmm.
year after year, we'll go through this manual process once, but then 2 years from now, it'll already be there, as opposed to saying, well, this is what Vanta can do for you, and now we have a whole nother repository for your evidence for these other ones that don't fit there.
So Vanta doesn't have or maintain high trust. It's all kind of manual. You have to add it. You have to maintain it.
No, for the most part, Vanta has, their policy documents that you can say, okay, I want to make sure these controls are in there. And it'll have control language that it can add to your policy documents. And it can verify that, you've got a policy that has, this language in it. These are ones that aren't mass produced. There's not a lot of organizations that probably have these controls, at least not a lot of Vanta customers that have these controls. So the control is there, but there's just nothing at this point that they can use as a test to say, we've got the evidence. So it's instead of adding it to like a SharePoint and then to MyCSF, we're going to be adding this into Vanta, as opposed to Vanta already having a template that says, hey, if you have your own policy document, we can use that and you can ignore what we're doing. Or you can say, yeah, let's use the Vanta policy and make sure that this language for this control is in there. And then it's an automated test that Vanta can do to say, oh, this policy has this language in it because Vanta inserted it in there.
Okay. Are they exclusive to policies and procedures?
No, there's other tests that
Okay.
you can run. There's a lot of connections into different environments, like cloud hosted environments and things. So we can run tests for, that your admin users are using a separate, unique user ID than all that. So there are other tests that can happen as well. So I'm in the process of exploring how best to go about this, but definitely on the side of, okay, Vanta is now your GRC repository. This is your RSAM or your Keylight or whatever, you're going to use for your GRC. You're going to be using Vanta for this. So I'm, consulting them that they continue to use this. So even though it's not giving them those prompts, we're going to manually add the evidence that they need to have in there.
Mhm. What's the general perspective that everybody has on GRC platforms in terms of how much value they add, um, you know, above and beyond somebody who, understands where once you get the policies and procedures mapped to the controls, and you've got that, kind of in place. Because this is something that I've struggled with. So it's not rhetorical. It is a genuine question, but I'm just curious about the value add and, which ones are maybe swinging heavier bats, versus kind of delivering what you could get out of a light, well-organized evidence repository.
My experience with GRC is very limited. The company that I had, I'd always heard about Archer and how great Archer was and all
Mhm.
that, but you need a full-time team to be able
Yeah.
to implement and administrate Archer. So it's for very large organizations, and it's kind of like the Cadillac of GRCs, or at least, probably 10 years ago was. Um,
Mm.
the organization that I had come into was using Keylight, which was started by some former Archer developers. And so they basically, I guess their kind of sales pitch was, well, this is what we, kind of when you solve a math problem, you solve it, and then the second time you solve it more efficiently. And that was kind of their claim to fame with Keylight was, hey, we did this once with Archer. Now we're doing it with a more streamlined solution, but still very effective. But what I found with
Mhm.
Keylight was, and I think I used this analogy before, it was almost like you buy playground equipment. Oh, you go to Home Depot and you're like, I'm going to buy a playground. But it's really just the slide and some of the plastic swings and things like that. And you still need to work with an architect and plan it out and figure out how much lumber you're going to need and where it's going to be positioned on your ground. It's not just
Mm.
a put it together, IKEA type playground. It's,
Yeah.
Keylight is still requires somebody to kind of have that. And if you don't already have good workflows in your organization, you have to build those workflows in order for then to
Mm.
replicate them in Keylight. So
Yeah.
we ended up just using SharePoint because the Keylight system we had didn't pull in HITRUST. So our PCI team loved it. They loved Keylight because they could pull in and it would automatically do the audit. There was an audit module for them. We had no way of pulling that in automatically. So we just kind of started, we did our own SharePoint system because
Yeah.
I had a person on the team that was really good with SharePoint. So that's kind of the only experience I've had with GRC tools other than RSAM, which is my CSF, which is clunky and prone to error when you're when you're trying to update 40, 50 controls all in one session.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else have anything to
Yeah,
add in there?
Steven's muted.
Of course I am. I was over here like speaking hard truth. Um,
Mm-hmm. Loved every second of it.
unless the tool can automatically gather and submit evidence, then it's just another fancy SharePoint.
Mhm.
And that's
Yeah.
what I'm looking to see with Vanta is, when we get to that point, because right now we're still in kind of readiness assessment, but when that evidence, because it's linking into a lot of their systems and pulling that, identity access management information and things like that. So it should be less manually intensive of uploading evidence. But I'll be curious to see then how that translates into, okay, now I want to push it to HITRUST and have HITRUST actually have that information linked into each of those controls.
Yep.
Because this is my first foray into Vanta.
So does
Yeah,
the assessor use Vanta?
The customer is using Vanta.
Okay. So where does
and
the assessor get access? Oh, sorry, Stephen, go ahead.
I was going to ask similar question. So the assessor logs into Vanta to review the evidence that's there and hits a button that goes over to HITRUST.
I don't know, because like I said, we're just working on the readiness at this point. So I don't know if the assessor will use Vanta and say, yes, it's ready, or they'll just, when we as the organization, as the readiness assessor say, yeah, we're ready to start the actual validated assessment. If we push the button or the customer pushes the button and it all goes into my CSF, and that's maybe where the assessor lives.
Yeah.
So more to come on
It's
that.
interesting because I always get a little um, apprehensive, I think is the right word, when we've got assessors who, like, people are just giving assessors access to whole internal kind of SharePoints or platforms or whatever, because there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes, and there is a mutual duty, a mutual responsibility on both the assessor and the organization, the assessor to not ask for more information than is required, and the organization to not provide information that's not requested. And that is beneficial on both sides. You know, because one, you're not going down rabbit holes unnecessarily, and two, you're not, sharing a bunch of information about the company that maybe isn't relevant to the topic and shouldn't be disclosed outside of company leadership or whatever. So it will be interesting to see where that goes, because if the assessor is not in Vanta, then you've still got to take all that information from Vanta, send it to the assessor, and the assessor is actually the ones responsible for putting it in HITRUST for the moment anyways. We all know that can change.
See, now we usually will upload the evidence to my CSF and then the assessor and then submit basically we upload the evidence, we put our self-assessed
Mhm.
scores, And then when that domain is filled, with the comments and everything, then we submit it to the assessor. And they typically should just be looking at that evidence there and then saying, if there's not sufficient evidence, they'll send that domain or that control back to us, and then we'll upload that evidence. So I think HITRUST would prefer that that the assessor lives strictly in MyCSF.
That's interesting because when I went for a client because there was a debate over who should be uploading the evidence, and I went straight to HITRUST and I said, "What's the rule on this?" And they said the assessor. They didn't hesitate either. There was no gray area there. They said the assessor should be doing that. And my experience with the self-assessment wasn't necessarily evidence-based. You have to put the scores in MyCSF and then transfer that through to the assessor. And then you provide
And then the assessor links the evidence in.
Yeah, because the
Okay.
assessors, especially if the assessor has an evidence request list, if you're not working with that in the first instance, then you're not, I mean, it could be misaligned with the assessor's process in any case. That's really interesting though.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Have
mean, the
you-
assessor's pulling in, they have a worksheet, they're using all those work papers and, they're sampling and all of that. And so,
Yeah.
how are they addressing their sampling and all that? So they're doing that piece of it. They're doing a separate QA piece of it as well. So it's not just the assessor that's uploading the evidence or reviewing the evidence. It's another QA person on their team that's
Yeah,
looking at that.
yeah.
But
That
yeah,
makes
I mean,
sense. Yeah.
I've worked it with, where we as the assessed organization sent the evidence to an intermediary site. So SharePoint or something,
Yeah.
not our internal
Smartsheet,
SharePoint, but yes,
SharePoint,
yeah, something like
Suralink.
that.
Yeah.
And then the assessor would upload it. But the projects that I'm working on now, I, as the readiness assessor, am uploading that evidence.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So I can't do it on an interim because I don't have access. The only group that has access to change anything in the interim assessment is the validated assessor. And I think all they do is there's 3 questions that they ask, has anything changed? Has the evidence sufficient? Do you agree that they should keep their interim assessment? Or should they keep their certification? So I don't even know if there's evidence that can be uploaded in an interim.
In an interim for which framework? Because R2, I1, they
R2, yeah.
definitely can.
Yeah, no, for an R2, I can't as being in the place of the validated or readiness assessor or the assessed entity, I don't have access. I can change external inheritance requests and I could submit those, but I can't upload any additional new documentation into that interim assessment.
Yeah. But the assessor definitely can. And it
The
is
assessor can,
absolutely
yes.
required for all the
Yes.
controls that they've chosen for the
Correct.
interim.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I was confused for a moment because it sounded like you were saying you just answered a few questions and off it went. And I thought, that is not my experience.
No, so for that interim, what I'm doing is I'm uploading everything into SharePoint, and then the assessor will go in to that shared SharePoint place
Yeah.
and get
Yeah.
the evidence. But yeah, for the regular validated assessments, at this point, I is that in that role of readiness assessor and uploading the evidence in there.
That's very interesting.
So different.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, does the assessor provide the evidence request list before you do your thing? 'Cause
For
too
this
early,
one,
right?
yeah, I mean, for this one, as the readiness assessor, I'm kind of providing that for the client to say, this is what I anticipate they're going to need. All your policies and procedures, so I put that in phases. So I'll be like, okay, here's the phase 1, and then once the assessor picks the samples, here's what you're going to need to provide for that. But I've kind of been that liaison.
You're doing a lot of assessor responsibilities.
Yes. Yes. I am.
Okay. That's a very lucky assessor you're working
Yes,
with.
I am. Yep. Yeah, and I mean it tracks to, because I had the experience as an interim or an internal assessor. So
Mhm.
I've already worked with assessors that I don't pick the samples, but I've worked in the past where I've had to be the one picking the samples and then giving the rationale of, okay, here's the list of 500 and this is how I picked to take 50 and here's the random sampling that I used and things like that. That I don't do. But I do okay, here's phase one. Let's figure out what all your gaps are. Let's make sure we've got evidence for anything that you're, maybe kind of questionable. Okay, here's when we're going to start the validated assessment and getting all
Mhm.
that. So, yep, definitely a value add. So, I mean, I feel like I'm embedded with the customer, but just as a kind of the way we've talked about with Sherpas, kind of as that I've got the
Yeah.
experience as that client
Yeah.
advocate.
So
It's
what are
just
the
kind of
pros
what,
and cons? I'm
yeah,
sorry, go
jump in,
ahead.
Jeff.
Well,
No,
I
no,
was
no,
going
you jump
to ask the pros and cons of being embedded so closely. So, I talked about
in.
mediation earlier, and I was an embedded mediator in organizations, and here you are embedding yourself that way. So, tell me about the pros and cons.
Well, a lot of times I'm working with companies that have like a dedicated CISO, but don't necessarily have a full-time compliance person. So they may have a project manager that they've put in there who's going to go work with the control owners and grab the evidence, but doesn't have any idea if that evidence is valid or not, whether it's showing, what that control is asking for. And so that's kind of where I come in to say, okay, first off, let's take you through what you're going to expect. Where there's phase one of evidence, which is kind of the general stuff. Then they're going to pick samples from that. And then we're going to have to, here's the more technical evidence that we're going to have to get for endpoints, people, training records, things like that, to just kind of prepare them for how this project is going to go. And then, looking at if they've got questions, I don't understand what this firewall evidence should be because of, the circumstances that we have. So it'll be basically, walking through and going, okay, here's the evidence that would typically pertain, et cetera, et cetera. And then, submitting all that, like I said, uploading all that to my CSF, submitting those domains to the assessor, as they're ready. And then if that assessor has any questions, kind of being that liaison back to the client to say, okay, I thought we had sufficient, but they're asking for more detail or more questions or whatever.
So, I think I hear you saying that you're more than bilingual, you're bicultural.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that a word? I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah.
Well,
It
it's
is now.
comfortable because when I was working at Change Healthcare, I mean, that's what we were. We were dedicated audit facilitators.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And then we had that independence. We were not embedded with I mean, we were part of the InfoSec organization, but we had a different reporting structure than the vulnerability, the patch management, any of the infrastructure teams, any of the development teams. So we had that level of independence. Our jobs weren't dependent on the vulnerability management program running smoothly or not. So
Yeah.
we have that independent look at it. So
Awesome.
to me, it's a very comfortable type of situation. But yeah, to Donna, to your point, when I was there at Change, we would upload our evidence to an intermediary and then the assessor. Because at first, back in 2017, they didn't necessarily need all the evidence in my CSF. That was back when HITRUST would pick, here are the controls, and then those were the ones that you had to add the evidence to. And then it kind of got to that, well, no, everything needs, you had to have comments for everything, but you didn't
Yeah.
necessarily have to have evidence. The assessor had to say, yes, I have. If you ask me for it, I have it. We're ready to go, but didn't all
Yeah.
necessarily have to be uploaded to my CSF.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we
Because
didn't
they've
want it.
got,
I mean, at that point, we were very nervous about, kind of how it gets to what you were talking about. We've talked about before with like evidence, naming evidence, and things like that, that you don't want to
yeah.
put, this is server XYZ's, configuration, because then people
Yeah.
know you have server XYZ.
With that
And so that was,
configuration.
Or Shelley
yeah,
Johnson's background check.
yes,
Like,
yeah,
you don't want that kind of
yeah. Shelley Johnson's failed
visibility.
background check, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely
Um,
don't want that.
yeah, it's definitely interesting because one of the reasons that um I like one of the roles that I feel is clients being able to ask questions that I mean, they can ask the assessors, but the assessors can't really help them because the assessors have to maintain that bit of distance between the entity they're assessing and, their like actual, the work that they're doing on the evaluation side. And so there definitely is a kind of I think a healthy gap that has to maintain,
Mhm.
right in that moment. And those are the moments where I can be useful because I'm not the assessor. And this is one of the reasons that I've talked to you about, I'm not pursuing an assessment certification. I'm not going down that path. So that there's no gray area, very clean line. I am not an assessor. I sit on the client side. And that's where I equally like to be able to, to learn. And this is why I'm out there looking for every kind of educational opportunity that I can to learn as much as possible without going down that this is an assessor certification type route. Because it's beneficial to know as much as possible about
Mhm.
all of those different questions and things that come up. But maintaining that very clean line that says, this is my role and I sit here. And this is, there is a line and this is the side that I sit. just,
Yeah, I
just
mean it,
for
and the
comfort for
assessor
everybody.
still the assessor still has the, the final say as far as
Mhm.
lowering a score or increasing a score.
Mhm.
So if they look at it and go, we're only 50% of the way there based on the evidence that you've given me, at that point I can kind of look at the, illustrative procedures and say, okay, well, what else could we potentially get that would do that? But, and I think that's really where they like the readiness assessors to kind of come in because they don't want to say during a gap analysis, yeah, you're fine, and then have to be the bad guys 3 months later going, oh yeah, missed the mark, sorry. That way it's me because I said, yeah, I think we're ready, I think we're 100%, and they're like, no, she was wrong, that we didn't have
Yeah.
what you needed here. So I mean, at that point, there is that level of independence, but I'm that voice of the customer speaking audit speak.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But all right. Anything else, or are we having a shortened version of the session today?
In the
We have
chat,
a
I
shorter
I,
version.
I put
Yeah.
3 links.
Oh,
One is
great.
for Walter Haydock from StackAware.
Thank
It's
you.
a link to his Substack, but he also is really active on LinkedIn. If you reach out to him, you're like, hey, Steve said you had a 42001 email training course, he'll send it over to you. Or you
Awesome.
can probably sign up directly from that Substack note. Donna, you had originally asked for like specific and yet like, I want the one training to rule them all. Um,
I know. I'm always looking for that needle in a haystack.
Yeah, that's going to be pretty difficult. But the prompt armor
Yeah.
one, general AI security and like the bad things that can happen with AI, probably one of the best general courses I've ever had. You can leave there with a bunch of notes to go back and start asking clients on how they mitigate those specific negative outcomes. The IAPP
Okay.
one, that's how I started my um, AI governance program. I took that training. And then once ISO 42001 came out, kind of dissected that and filled in gaps there. And then during the HITRUST audit process, we checked that factor for NIST AI risk management framework, and that
Mhm.
added a ton of controls and that improved the program as well.
Okay. Yeah. It's it's I greatly appreciate the information. I'm going to check this out because I think, anybody who's in the realm should never hesitate to pursue additional information. There's a lot of folks that I come across who are hesitant to, go down. It's not necessarily about certifications because I'm with you on that, Stephen. But it is about information, and there are so many changes. The sector is constantly evolving, and constantly progressing to, new best practices and new frameworks and new positioning. If you look 3 or 4 years ago, even at the state ramp, gov ramp programs, they've changed a lot in the last few years, in terms of what it means to have state ramp and which states have reciprocity, and, how you can, knock several down with one instead of having to go to text ramp and, individual states. So absolutely, like, I'm always looking for what is that, what are the courses that would give me best visibility across different frameworks. So not framework agnostic specifically, but really encompassing, so that you can include and go, right, okay, I understand this one, and what the difference is. So greatly appreciate it, and hopefully we'll be able to share some of that with folks who were not able to join us online today, so they can check out those links and some of those sources.
Yeah, I'll definitely put them in the description for
That sounds great.
in our YouTube description when we publish this.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds really good.
But I would can imagine that that would be a difficult certification or course to keep up with, because I was just seeing on LinkedIn today that the state of New York has new requirements that just came effective as of today
Mhm.
or as of yesterday. So
Yeah.
that would be a constantly evolving course or certification to take. You talk
It
about your
would be. And
continuing education credits.
yeah, but this is where I feel like a centralized course that says, what is the theory? What's the philosophy behind this particular framework? What's the goal of it? Who's best served by it? Because then it's getting a slightly out of the weeds on the individual controls, because high trust changes all the time too. But that doesn't change the philosophy behind high trust and some of the other factors that you can apply and how you approach it. And, so absolutely agree. And I think there's that deviation, the assessors need to know on the individual controls, what's been added, what's been removed, how do you test for it, where does it, on those specific controls. And I think just having that slightly higher level perspective, I mean, that's what I'm seeking out. So, I'll continue my mission. I feel like I'm on a holy grail journey here. Although that brings back a whole bunch of Monty Python situations. So
Mhm.
I know. Well, that's what we'll start the course with. Some Monty Python
Merc.
references, and then
fabulous.
yeah, I mean, because yeah, for me, I mean, looking at it and just trying to even encompass, okay, what are the differences? I mean, I did a SOC 2 and versus high trust, and I kind of did that for my practicum when I got my master's degree, because I was living that at the time. I was going through two simultaneous certifications, and so I was kind of like, or compliance audits, and so I was kind of like, okay, does it make sense for these to go together? What's different? What's the same? But then later going with ISO 27001, it felt so much different, because it's not just a point in time, like one time the auditor's there and then they're not. It was the rules that they had were very strict about showing up in person, and then having basically 2 stages of the certification review, which was management controls, kind of that high level approach, but it got very technical. And then the 136 specific technical pieces that you had to evidence. So it definitely, and it was the difference between an assessment, hey, I can help you if you could give me this evidence, that would, versus an audit, which is, do you have the evidence to prove this, yes or no? And I can't help you, guide you with, if you could give me this book, that would show me whatever you're looking for. So it's definitely completely different. But I guess sometimes, you just have to kind of go through it, and then, then looking at, what are some of the other more popular ones, and how those would approach differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We can crowdsource
absolutely.
a course at some point.
Crowdsource the deep end of the assessors, and just conduct individual interviews.
Well, what we could do is each of us take one of them and like,
I'll assess
so all
you.
four of us, and then we can just go, oh, that's different than this, and just kind of wrap up at the end, and people will be like,
Yes.
okay,
Yes.
all right.
Well, we'll assess the assessments.
Yes, exactly. We'll walk through them and then go compare and contrast,
Hmm.
or get AI to do it.
Or get AI to do it. We still have to have somebody vet that, though.
Yes, there's.
All right. Well,
All right.
thanks,
Well,
everybody.
thanks everybody, and we will talk. I'm trying to get once everything kind of settles down at High Trust. There's a new president, so I'm connected with him
Yeah.
on LinkedIn. I was gonna hit him up in a couple of weeks, or and say, hey, at some point you want to come on and talk about where you are with this and all that. So, and hopefully
That'd
we
be
can get
really
Ryan
cool.
Patrick.
Great.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
thought I was like, I don't want
Yeah.
him to be like I'm just going through my onboarding training right now. So, give him a little bit of time, but hopefully get him at some point, maybe in the first of the year with an outlook for 2026 or something. So, but, all right, well, stay tuned and tune back in.
Thanks. Have a
Thanks,
good rest of your day,
everybody.
guys.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everybody.
Hey, thanks for watching. We really appreciate it. If you got value from this episode, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next High Trust Secrets. We go live every Thursday at 2 p.m. Central and dig into real-world compliance and security topics. And each session gets uploaded right here after the live show. So whether you're catching us live or on your own time, make sure you're subscribed. We'd love to have you along on your High Trust journey.